the state. China gives Pakistan nuclear weapons design information and 50 kilograms of weapon-grade uranium back in the early 80s. So Pakistan can build a bomb. North Korea sells Syria a nuclear reactor. U.S. actually helped France refine its nuclear weapons designs. So you have the state helping another state. Another case is something like the Khan network. You have a transnational network that's selling essentially whole nuclear facilities, but it's not state sanctioned. And so in the case of the Khan network, there's debates on whether his help to North Korea was state sponsored, or even some of the work he did helping Iran. I don't think there's anybody who thinks that what Khan did with Libya was state sponsored, that there was an attempt to give Libya the ability to make nuclear weapons and for cash. And then there's what is much more common now, where a state organizes essentially a procurement network that goes out and buys things illegally overseas in order to outfit outfit nuclear facilities, so that they, in essence, they're buying subcomponents, equipment to make things, raw materials, in order to put together the facility. And most of the counterproliferation efforts today really focus on that latter one, because that's what you see Iran doing, North Korea, Pakistan. The states are very worried. States like the United States are very worried about the state-to-state and the Khan type, but fortunately they don't happen that often. Now, just to refresh your memories on a gas centrifuge, which will really be at the heart of what I discussed today, that if you remember particularly the one on your right, the parts of the centrifuge with the rotor assembly, the molecular pump that's held up by a magnet, it's rotating on a bottom bearing, a pin assembly. And all these things have to be built. And then you have to be able to run the centrifuge and run it in large numbers in a cascade. And the cascade has equipment associated with it, piping, measuring equipment, valves, vacuum pumps. And so again, all these things have to be acquired. And what the Khan network was doing was saying, look, we'll sell you the entire centrifuge plant. It'll be, if you're familiar with the idea of turnkey, it would be literally you would get the keys to the facility, open it, and then it would work. So that was their philosophy, was to try to sell entire facilities. And of course, if it's a country like Iran, they wanted to, in a sense, cherry pick it. They didn't want to buy everything offered. Libya wanted to buy it all. And here's another picture of a cascade. And here, just again, fresher memories, this is a P2 centrifuge rotor assembly. And this was actually provided by the Khan network to Libya as a sample of what a rotor assembly would look like. They hadn't actually got to the point of making the rotor assemblies for Libya, but this one was one of the samples, and you can see on it you can see the pin that the centrifuge would spin on. You can see that the convolution in the middle is the bellows, and this is made out of Miraging steel. And Khan also provided some small number of these to North Korea, and that became one of the things North Korea used to create its program. And in the North Korean case, they didn't want to buy a whole centrifuge plant. They wanted, in essence, what they got was a starter kit to build centrifuges. And in the case of North Korea, the Khan network was more than happy to provide more. And in fact, it looks like they were trying to draw North Korea into the Khan network and North Korea would provide uranium for example, to Libya, particularly refined uranium in the form of uranium hexafluoride, the feed gas for a centrifuge. But largely due to U.S. government intervention, Khan was fired from his job in 2001, and then focused on intensely by intelligence agencies, and his whole operation was busted up in 2003. So North Korea's involvement in the Khan network didn't actually take off. Now, what I'd like to do, and again, I think what I'll have to do is, if you want to learn more about this, you can look at peddling peril. There's also on our website there's a tab on peddling peril, where we have a study on the Libyan case that's much more detailed than what's in the book. But what I'd like to start with is that it wasn't just Libya, North Korea, and Iran that they tried to sell to. One of their very first efforts was Iraq, and it was done in October of 1990. And it gives you a flavor of Khan's attitudes, where here Saddam Hussein has invaded Kuwait. The United States, with its allies, is creating a coalition aimed at getting Iraq out of Kuwait. And one of Khan's agents shows up in Baghdad saying, "We'll sell you an atomic bomb program." And this is actually a copy of an original that was brought by the agent to Baghdad and presented to Iraqi intelligence. And I'll go through it in a second, but it was found in a collection of documents that had been revealed by the Iraqis in 1995. And this was after Hussein Camel defected and was offering the West, essentially, I'll become, you give me lots of rewards, I'll tell you really what happened in these programs. And up until 95, Iraq had actually been hiding quite a bit from the inspectors. And what Saddam did is he made a decision to just reveal everything he could. And one part of it was to take just every document they could find that they'd been hiding from the inspectors, throw them in a collection, put it at Hussein Camel's farm in a chicken coop, and then tell the inspectors to go there. And then they said, "Look at this terrible stuff Hussein Camel was hiding from you." So in a sense, that was their reaction to try to essentially undermine Hussein Camel, to make whatever he could offer the West worthless by actually providing more, and then blaming Hussein Camel for hiding it all from the inspectors. So it was actually a pretty effective counter move. And Hussein Camel really didn't get very far in trying to build this constituency in the West to become an opponent to Saddam. Eventually went back to Iraq and was promptly killed. But anyway, here's the offer that the agent of A.Q. Khan brought to Baghdad, and we can just go through it. If you want to read it, I mean, it's Pakistan had to spend a period of 10 years and an amount of $300 million to get it. AB stands for atomic bomb, and that largely would go into making the centrifuge plant. And now with the practical experience and the worldwide contacts Pakistan has already developed, you can have it in about 3 years' time, and by spending about half of $150 million. So it was essentially to offer everything they needed to build an atomic bomb. And so the first thing is they're going to offer the atomic bomb design itself, and that was separately priced at $5 million. And one of the things that actually caused some suspicion about this offer when it was found in this collection was it seemed like $5 million isn't a lot of money to pay for an atomic bomb design. But I'll give another example a little later where the price you get for these classified documents isn't as high as you may think.
What do you think about the 10% commission rate? Do you feel like that's almost suspicious in the sense that it may be low? Or?
No, I'll talk about that. I mean, it's not low at all, actually. It's a fairly standard rate. Okay. And again, I'll show you another document in this set. There's actually, I think, 4 or 5 documents that were found, because when this came into Iraqi intelligence, they don't know what it means, but they took the offer seriously because the guy who brought it had been kind of validated by another smuggler that they worked with, a Greek smuggler involved in getting them weapons. And sophisticated equipment, and he validated the Pakistani, but they didn't know what it meant. They sent it to the Atomic Energy Establishment for evaluation, and the Iraqis always denied this. They said they denied that this ever happened. Finally, one sort of admitted that, yeah, someone came to offer us an atomic bomb, but we thought it was a sting operation. But in general, they tried to avoid talking about this. But it was an intensive investigation by the action team at the time to try to uncover the meaning. And I think they left feeling this was one of the major unsettled issues. This is when they left in '98, one of the major unsettled issues with the Iraqis, that they felt there was enough evidence about this to take it seriously. But in terms of the second point, that they were offering here to get components, and it also means equipment, on their behalf through the Dubai office, which at the time was a major smuggling point for the Khan network. There was a company called Ben Balaya, and that was being heavily used by Khan to procure things for his own program. And at the time, people weren't really focused on this kind of indirect transport, where the goods would maybe be U.S. or European, but the end user would be listed as Dubai. And in fact, it wasn't. It would be put on a ship and then transported onward to Pakistan. Now we're very familiar with that, but at the time, people weren't paying much attention to it. Certainly, Dubai had no export control laws that would have made this illegal to retransfer the equipment. And the 10% commission on those procurements is pretty standard. I mean, Khan has a famous comment. I can't remember the exact quote, but essentially it was, I'll get someone to buy it. I'll get I'll get someone to buy it if he doesn't, and I'll offer him 10%. If Tom isn't willing to do it, I'll find somebody else and offer him a little more, and they'll procure the equipment for me. So it's if they can get more, they will. But one thing that happens is all these programs have budgetary constraints. I mean, that's one of the things that drives some of the illicit trade is, if they want a piece of equipment, they want it to be a good piece of equipment that works, they can go out and buy it, or they can make it themselves. If they have to make it themselves, they're going to have to invest quite a bit of money in the infrastructure to make that piece of equipment, which they don't, and they don't even need that many of them. And so they have to be very careful of what they indigenize, because very soon they would have exhausted their budget and more in order to make these things. So they're going to, for just simple economic reasons, they're going to be out buying things. Now, one of the things in the second half of point 2 is fairly generous, that if Iraq goes out and buys it itself, they don't charge any commission. I mean, they're in essence telling Iraq what you need for a centrifuge program, but you just go out and get it yourself, and we don't care. They're in point 3 offering free technological assistance, which is, so they're looking for these commissions, and they're sweetening the pot by saying, we'll give you designs and other technological assistance so you can build a centrifuge. And they're also willing to offer up 2 top persons, and this really means in their centrifuge program, who can come and answer your questions. Because you're always going to have questions as you develop a centrifuge. And to have this kind of, it's almost like a 1-800 number that you can call and get help.
Customer service.
Yeah, and they're willing to offer it for free. So and they're even saying even more. We'll get some to quit and come and be resident there. Now, what happened is they didn't know very much about what Iraq was pursuing. They didn't really know much about Mehdi Ubaidi and his team in 1990. That was a very secret effort. They would have seen some stuff in the press, but Iraq had no interest in the centrifuge part of this. That Mehdi had his own, as he's talked about, his own network. He had gotten his own classified information, and they were moving pretty steadily ahead with the centrifuge program. So they had no real interest in that part of it. But after Iraq invaded Kuwait and they realized the intense opposition to the invasion, they launched a crash nuclear weapons program. And that part of the program, of the nuclear program, was interested in what Khan had to offer, namely the bomb design. And they had started their nuclear weapons program in about 1987. It had moved fairly slowly, and they were given the order in August 1990. You've got to build the bomb in months. And so they were going to use the safeguarded highly enriched uranium that had come in for research reactors as the fuel. Some of it was only enriched to 70%. The centrifuge people were tasked to come up with a centrifuge cascade that could go from 70 to 90%. The nuclear weapons people greatly accelerated their work. They'd built a nuclear weapons production facility, a place called Al Thir in Iraq, and it was dependent on equipment bought from all over the world, and it was, in their own words, kind of busy as a beehive in the fall. But they were actually stuck and having trouble on miniaturizing. They had a design for something that was 1.2 meters across, but to get it on the missile that they had, they needed to get it down to about 0.8 meters per second, and that was causing them some complications. And so, after evaluation by the nuclear people, this was going to be their response to the military intelligence people to take back to the Pakistani agent. And here this is a translation of the Arabic. I don't know if we put up the Arabic, this set of information. I mean, at some point we may. I don't know why we haven't. But and as you can see, this is document 7. So I think there was a total of 8 documents in this set. So, and this was in English, and I'll come to that in a minute. So everything else was in Arabic. But basically, it was a response back to the military intelligence in answer to their letter asking for clarification of what to do. And the nuclear people were very worried that this could be a setup, could be a sting operation, because that's another very common tool in counterproliferation is you try to lure the smugglers into traps. And so they were worried that this was one of them. And so in the first paragraph, they're just more or less saying that. The way they put it, hostile bodies still adopt a policy of embroilment. And the thing that we have to be most on our guard against with such offers is that they may be a deliberate attempt to see how the land lies. In essence, in this case, to penetrate the program and see the status of their nuclear weapons work, their secret enrichment work. And this was really produced under the guidance of the head of the father would have been the father of their atomic bomb, Jafar, and he had spent a lot of time trying to do things very secretly. And at this point in time, the West did not know anything about his EMIS enrichment program. It remained a total secret. And they knew very little about the weaponization program. And so he was very careful. And so what he wanted to do was to instruct the Iraqi intelligence to try to mislead the requesting entity, this agent. So he doesn't get any sense of what is really going on inside the nuclear weapons program. And also to probe deeper to make sure that it isn't a secret operation to uncover their program. But they were intrigued and they wanted to get a sample of the nuclear weapons design. But they wanted more than that. They wanted they wanted not only a specimen of the design, but they wanted the calculations that accompanied the design. So they wanted something a little deeper. And they wanted to, in a sense, validate that it was a genuine nuclear weapons design. And so they instructed the intelligence people to send this English text back to the agent. And these things, because people have to move places, the agent of Khan had to come to Baghdad, they'd have to set up another meeting. This thing never developed past this point as far as the action team could determine. by January the attack of the West started and shut down all of this. And so this letter was mid-October, and as far as anyone could determine, there were no successive meetings after that date. And no one's been successful to track down the agent. His name is known, but there are more than one person in Pakistan with that name, and it was never able to find it. And the Iraqis, as I mentioned earlier, were completely uncooperative. And there was an effort to track down a translator who'd been in the meeting with the agent and the military intelligence, and he'd migrated to Australia, and actually I think become a citizen, and he refused to cooperate. So this remained an outstanding issue when the inspection ended in '98. But it's viewed as Khan's, one of the most clear efforts of Khan, not only being willing to provide everything you need to make a nuclear weapons, centrifuge plant, the bomb designs, help making everything, but also that he was willing to do it right and to help a country get a nuclear weapon to stop the United States and its allies from being able to achieve its goals. So it was actually a shock when this was found. I had a copy of it, I don't know, '96 or so, and I remember when I saw it for the first time, it really stunned me that here's our ally supposedly, and everyone knows they had a nuclear weapons program against India, but he was willing to give our enemy at the time a nuclear weapon to use against us in an upcoming war. Now, the major customer of the Khan network was Libya. That was in a sense, that's where they really struck gold. I won't have time to cover Iran, but Libya under Gaddafi had been seeking nuclear weapons almost since he came to power, and he had never been able to put together an infrastructure. Maybe in a way described a technological scientific infrastructure in Iraq that they had put together and were building from. Libya had almost nothing. And Gaddafi's approach had always been to try to buy it. And so for the Khan network, that's perfect, because Libya has money, they have something to offer. They don't want an infrastructure there necessarily, because that if there is, it'll undermine their ability to make money. And so the Libyan deal was by far the most ambitious. And I want to cover two cases from this, just to show how some of this illicit procurement works. And one of the innovations of the Khan network was that it realized that export controls are, at that time, particularly extremely weak. And A.Q. Khan in 2002 he's lost his job as head of the centrifuge program. He's under deep suspicion by the United States that he's doing something nefarious, and so he can't make centrifuge components in Pakistan. And he needs to make enough components for 10,000 centrifuges. And so he has the idea, let's find places that you could put together a factory to make components, but no one's going to even think you'd do it there. And so he came up with this idea, or his colleagues, to make a bunch of the components in Malaysia. And they literally bought the equipment. It was organized by colleagues, or a node we call it, in Switzerland. They bought the equipment and sent it to this workshop in Malaysia. It was called Scope, and it involves computer numerically controlled machine tools and other types of machine tools. And they bought the raw materials, and they started making all these components for centrifuges. And so this is an outer casing of a centrifuge, and this set is non-rotating components. Here's actually, if this would be the outer casing with the molecular pump, looking from the top. And so the outer casing would be made, the molecular pump, and then they would insert the molecular pump into the casing. All the while, the people in the factory don't have some of them know they're for centrifuges. The Malaysian government later, in its defense, when this is revealed, says, they had no idea this was going on. And it is, most people wouldn't recognize this as anything particularly sensitive. And that was part of the genius of Khan, was to go to a place where certainly the government would have no knowledge of this. And they could, and at the time, Malaysia had no export controls either. And so it was a very safe place to work. And here, they made many other components that are needed. And I won't go through them in detail, but just, again, they're not very recognizable. Now, Malaysia's defense in the end is they said these are dual-use goods. They could be used for many purposes. But in fact, they are single-use. These are only usable in a gas centrifuge. And in this case, it's the P2 centrifuge. Now, this is going to be a little complicated, but I want to go through, again, the supply chain of one of the components and try to make sense out of it. And also to show you the transnational nature of this. But before I do, did you have any questions?
How long was he able to operate in Malaysia for?
A couple years, until they were busted. And that's another story of how they got busted. I mean, there's two fairly large studies on our website on we call it the Tinner case. The CIA was able to get on one of the nodes. It was a family, a father, two sons. The wife was involved, of the father, and was able to turn them. And they became critical in exposing this network. And one of the sons, Urs, was actually in charge of the scope operation. So he was running the Malaysian operation, the factory itself. And so they were able to arrange, with Ur's help, the CIA was able to arrange, and it was CIA MI6 operation, that they could figure out when the components would be shipped. And they would go to Dubai, and then they would go to Libya. And so they organized a seizure of the ship between Dubai and Italy. I'm sorry, in Libya, and they ordered the ship to go to Libya. And then what they got was all basically the evidence that these centrifuge components were being made, and Libya had ordered them. So in a sense, it was the smoking gun, and it was a ship called the BBC China. Yeah.
I feel like other than the Tinners, I feel like you almost only hear about A.Q. Khan.
Mm-hmm.
Have a lot of other people, his associates, been indicted, implicated, prosecuted,
Not very many. I mean, no.
This must have been a fairly
No, it was. It was. Yeah.
Operation.
No, and one of the people who helped the Tinners was, I think, just went to trial a couple weeks ago.
Okay.
I don't know the details anymore. But he wasn't that important, but he refused to cooperate with the authorities, and so they ended up prosecuting him. They prosecuted the Tinners in Switzerland too, and it became quite controversial because the CIA wanted him out of jail, and went to great lengths to try to, I argue, to undermine the Swiss judicial system to try to free the Tinners, including organizing or pressing to have all the evidence destroyed. And the Swiss government did it. But they didn't realize that there were other sets of evidence. And so that over time, that evidence emerged, and the prosecutor was able to pull together a case to then prosecute the Tinners. And from a prosecution point of view, the Tinners, yeah, maybe they were good in the end. And yeah, maybe they shouldn't get as much jail time, but they were criminals for, father was he goes back to helping Khan in the 70s. He helped Iraq. We suspect he helped Iran. And so here's a really bad actor, and he's got to be brought to justice. And it's a little bit like a mafia informer. I mean, if a mafia informer emerges in the United States, the U.S. Justice Department doesn't take the point of view, well, okay, we now forget about all the crimes. He's still liable for the crimes, but he's going to be treated differently for cooperation. And what the U.S. government had done was to kind of disrupt that effort and the prosecutor went ahead. And in the end, there was an arrangement to have the Tinners plead guilty and then not serve any jail time or have many fines. And well, there were eight arrested. Okay. I think nobody was ever prosecuted in Pakistan. They served house arrest for various periods of time. No, it was really a tragedy in Pakistan. And I think if A.Q. Khan travels, he could be arrested. There's still countries that I think would be interested in having him arrested and prosecuted. So I doubt if he's running around the world very freely. There were the other nodes in South Africa that was busted. People were brought to trial. One cooperated. One was mostly, two were targeted, particular for prosecution. One died before trial. One was given house arrest, essentially. Others who worked with him in South Africa weren't prosecuted. In Germany and Switzerland, I mean, there was a guy named Lehr, and he was prosecuted. And he was also targeted. I mean, part of this, I mean, just some of this is in peddling peril, but in 2002, the CIA, MI6 are pretty knowledgeable about these guys' activities. And these guys had been working since the 70s. They started with Khan. And some had actually been brought to trial and for minor export violations and were well known. And they did, I think, attempt either to scare Lehr or recruit him. There was a note dropped off at his house that, we'd like to talk to you, sort of a recruitment letter. Lehr is a very hard case. No one's gotten him to talk, including the IA when they were investigating all this. And so it wasn't surprising that a couple of weeks later, another note was dropped off at his house to the effect of, we just found your dead body in the river, or very threatening note, and it had an effect. I mean, when the IA met Lehr, he was still furious. This is a few years later. He was really furious about this threatening letter. So these guys were well known. Essentially, Lehr got 1 year in jail. Some, I don't know, I forget the amount, a couple million euro fine, and but he made tens of millions of euros through these deals over the years. So there was never really justice done, and it pointed out, in fact, that here you had one of the worst cases of proliferation ever. And there wasn't really the laws in place to prosecute these people, and the export control system leaked like a sieve, where you had major countries with no export controls at all. So it was a wake-up call, and it certainly led to improvements. And let me give this example where it's a minor part of a centrifuge. It's called a motor housing. Essentially, what it is that if you're going to spin a rotor, you have to have a motor to make it spin, and there's a housing that would hold the motor, an aluminum part that would hold the motor at the bottom of the centrifuge, and it's made from a low quality aluminum, and what I'd like to do is just go through the manufacturing of it to show you the sophistication of this network. And this was an order that went to one of the tinner companies. It's called Traco. And it came from the Dubai, which was one of the kind of the central hubs of the Khan network for Libya, where a lot of the orders and shipments would move through Dubai. And at Gulf Technical Industries, which was another member named Peter Griffin and his son were operating this, and they sent this order for what amounts to well, actually, I can send it around. This is the whole list, and it's essentially in doing business. There's all kinds of things. This is an order confirmation, and it was from May 30th, 2001, and it gives a listing of all the parts. And again, if you intercept this, you don't have any idea what it is. What is part number 9001? 9,003. It actually turns out the motor housing is 9,003. And so he'd ordered, for Khan, had ordered 10,000 of these things for the Libyan centrifuge program. And it gives the prices. So here, the motor housing, it's 87 Swiss francs per piece, and the total order then is for about 870,000 Swiss francs. And then here's the, it's signed by Marco Tinner, Urs' brother, confirming the order. And the total order is for about 3 million Swiss francs. Now, what I'd like to do is go through this supply chain where if you're going to make the motor housing, you have to get the aluminum. You then have to find a company to make the components, and then you have to transport them. And here is the delivery note of the company which was recruited by Khan to get the aluminum. And it was a company based in Singapore called Bakar Metal Asia. And they required all these aluminum parts. Much of the aluminum went to scope to make those components I showed you earlier. This order for a round aluminum bar went to this company Kirag in Chur, Switzerland. And again, what you have here is, somebody sitting in Singapore ordering something from aluminum manufacturers. Could be, we think they were in Italy, and then the Italian company ships it up to Switzerland. So you have quite a international involvement, none of which is detected, and remains hard to detect. And again, this is again a case of the aluminum isn't controlled. It's a very common, almost soft aluminum. So where are we? So the rods get sent to Kirag in Switzerland. They can't do anything without a design. And so what happens is Traco, which is Marco's company, sends them a design. And again, they made 30 components at Kirag. And this was part of the evidence that it's illegal to have centrifuge components made at Kirag and then transport them out of the country. And what we did on this is we took off all the numbers. So it's a little hard to see it, but essentially this is the top. Here's sort of the schematic from the side that the motor housing would come in from the bottom. This allows the bottom bearing or some other mechanisms to come down through the middle. But it's not a noticeable. You're not going to look at this and go, centrifuge component. And in fact, most of the drawings are not that obvious. But there are some that are a little more obvious. There's scoops, the scoops for the centrifuge, the little tubes that would take up the depleted or product and move it to the next centrifuges. That was in this order. And this was organized before the Tinners' turn and worked for the CIA. And that was part of the prosecutor's determination to prosecute them, was these guys were clearly seeking to break the law. And just because they become informants for the CIA does not get them a get out of jail free card. And Kirag proceeded to make the parts. And the parts were sent to Turkey, where there was another node of the Khan network. And it was people who had worked with Khan starting from the 70s or early 80s. And they were involved in making the motors for the centrifuge and the electronic pieces of the centrifuges. And they were buying, and they were ideally placed because they were able to buy all these, either the equipment itself or the subcomponents when they started to make it in Europe. And so it was very easy to avoid any scrutiny from European export authorities because the material could just be trucked to Turkey. And the node was strategically placed to take advantage of getting things out of Europe. And this isn't, I guess this is the total amount that went to the Turkish company, Techno-Electric. And it also shows that not all had gone to Turkey by the time the Tinners started to work with CIA, and they sent some of it to the United States. And what this is actually, again, part of the evidence. Marco had written a document for the Swiss police about what he'd done. And he's covering his tracks, but he's willing to say, I sent this number to, ordered this number sent to Turkey of the motor housing, this number I gave to the U.S. And then he tried to explain one last shipment to Turkey, which happened actually after the BBC China's in October, I believe, of 2003. The shipment was in April of 2004. So they've already been busted and shut down the network. And he ordered another shipment to go to Turkey. This was his explanation, that the flanges were used by the recipient in Turkey for other processes. We had no possibility not to deliver these parts. To retain them without delivery, production in Turkey would have fallen behind, and we would have had a problem with the buyer, Buyer Gulf, the original buyer in Dubai, and they didn't know what happened to the parts. In fact, there's been a lot of speculation. I mean, some of it is that they just wanted to make more money, and they actually charged the CIA money to do their nefarious deeds for them, in a sense betraying. So they were getting money from both sides of this thing, and so it may have just been simple greed. But the other part is maybe they were doing this at the orders of the CIA, because the Turkish people were under tremendous pressure, and one of the older member of this node had been picked up by the police in Turkey, interrogated, and he died. He had a heart attack during this interrogation. And so the one thought is that maybe they were going to try to do something against Iran, and that the Tinners were going to help feed equipment into Iran that would be defective. And this was part of that scheme. Now, back to the story. For most of the items, they were shipped on to Dubai and then put on the BBC China, and then they were intercepted by the U.S. Although some actually, I think some made it to Libya, I think. Well, I can't remember that. But probably made it to Libya, and then they were taken by the United States to Oak Ridge. And here's President Bush holding one of the motor housings, and this white thing here is the motor that had been inserted in Turkey.